In the waning years of the 23rd century, Major Aaron Malv stood at the edge of the grand balcony overlooking Mavenor Square. The ancient golden-plated buildings of Quarnall gleamed in the afternoon light, their silver-inlaid temples catching the dying sun's rays. Thousands of Cornet citizens had gathered below, their faces upturned, a sea of anticipation and hesitant joy after decades of oppression under the Carvani Empire. Aaron adjusted his formal Terran Accord uniform, crisp lines of navy and silver, the emblem of interstellar freedom prominently displayed on his left breast, as the planetary envoy assigned to oversee Quarnall's transition to democracy. Today marked the culmination of Operation New Dawn, the successful liberation of yet another world from tyrannical rule. "Citizens of Quarnall," he began, his voice amplified across the square. "Today marks your first day as free people." The translator droned beside him, converted his words into the melodic Cornet language, its cadence rising and falling like water over stones. A cheer rose from the crowd, though Aaron noted it seemed muted, almost uncertain. Still, the Terran banners fluttered proudly above the ancient square, symbols of hope and democracy replacing the severe emblems of Carvani control that had dominated for generations. "The old governor's palace," he continued, gesturing to the massive stone building behind him, "will now serve as your House of Representatives. No longer will it be a place of oppression, but a sanctuary for your voices, your dreams, your future." He reached for the ceremonial ribbon stretched across the entrance. With this act, Quarnall enters an era of equality, freedom, and self-determination. The scissors sliced through the ribbon, and the applause that followed sounded like rainfall, scattered, uneven, but growing. Aaron smiled broadly, his idealism burning bright. After all, he was known throughout the Terran Accord as the Freedom Architect, the man who had overseen successful democratic transitions on 7 other liberated worlds. Quarnall would be his 8th triumph, or so he believed. The following morning, Aaron convened the first meeting with the Provisional Council of Quarnall. The chamber, once the private war room of Carvani officials, had been hastily converted with a circular table to symbolize equality among the representatives. 15 delegates, a mix of resistance leaders, community elders, and educated professionals, had been selected to form this transitional government. Aaron waited as they filed in, noting their formal attire, the traditional silver-threaded robes of Cornet cultural significance, now worn openly after being banned under Carvani rule. His heart swelled with pride at this small victory for cultural expression. "Representatives," he began, once they were seated, "today we begin planning your democratic future. The Terran Accord doesn't impose any specific system. You are free to design your own governance model. We only require that it upholds the Universal Charter of Rights." He activated the holographic display showing the timeline for elections, constitutional drafting, and the eventual withdrawal of Terran oversight. "Within 6 months, we aim to have your first free elections. My team will provide educational resources, voter registration systems, and security protocols to ensure—" "Envoy Malva," interrupted an older delegate, whom Aaron recognized as Perix Theron, his voice crackling with age, but resonant with authority. "We are grateful for our liberation, but what framework shall we operate within now?" The question hung in the air. Aaron blinked, momentarily confused. "The framework of freedom, Representative Perix. You are now free to choose your own path." Perix's weathered face creased further. "Yes, but within what boundaries? What guidelines shall direct our choices?" Around the table, several older representatives nodded in agreement, their eyes betraying a discomfort that Aaron hadn't anticipated. A younger woman, Lyra Vesson, who had fought in the resistance, looked equally confused by the elder's question. "That's the beauty of democracy," Aaron explained patiently. "You create those guidelines together, as equal citizens." Perix exchanged glances with other elderly members. We understand the concept, envoy. But practically speaking, how shall we function tomorrow? What rules govern our interactions now that the Carvani codes are abolished? It was the first warning sign, a small crack in Aaron's vision of a smooth transition. Later that evening, he discussed the meeting with Lieutenant Serena Voss, his political advisor, in their temporary headquarters. They seemed lost, he admitted, pacing the room, as if freedom itself was disorienting. Serena, her analytical mind always several steps ahead, nodded. For generations, the Cornet lived under the dominator's religion, absolute obedience to hierarchy and order. Then came the Carvani, who exploited that cultural tendency and enforced brutal labor conditions and thought control. They've never known self-determination. Aaron frowned. We've seen cultural adjustment periods before, on Veltrix and New Avalon, but this felt different. It is different, Serena replied, pulling up demographic data on her tablet. Those worlds had underground democracy movements for decades before liberation. Quarnal's resistance was fighting against oppression, not necessarily for democracy. There's a distinction. Aaron stopped pacing, his idealism momentarily shadowed by doubt. Are you suggesting they're not ready for freedom? I'm suggesting, Serena said carefully, that we may need to adjust our timeline and increase educational initiatives. Freedom without context might feel like abandonment to them. Aaron nodded decisively. Then we'll give them context. Establish the Quarnal Legislative Academy immediately. Intensify civic education. Schedule daily public forums. If they don't understand freedom yet, we'll teach them. His determination was boundless. After all, every liberated people deserved freedom, whether they immediately understood how to use it or not. The Quarnal Legislative Academy opened within a week, housed in what had once been a Carvani propaganda center. The irony wasn't lost on Aaron as he watched citizens of all ages file into the building for the first classes on basic rights, voting procedures, and democratic dialogue. He'd appointed Kyan Vor, one of the few Cornet educators with off-world experience, as the Academy's director. The man's enthusiasm matched Aaron's own, though his eyes carried the haunted look of someone who had survived the harshest Carvani labor camps. Today's curriculum focuses on the concept of voting, Kyan explained, as they observed a classroom from the doorway. Inside, about 30 citizens, mostly younger ones, listened attentively as an instructor explained the mechanics of secret ballots. How are the elder citizens responding to the training? Aaron asked. Kyan's expression tightened slightly. They attend, but with reservation. Yesterday, one asked whether all this choice might lead to social breakdown. Another wondered if there would be punishment for making wrong political decisions. Wrong decisions? Aaron echoed. They've lived in a world where political mistakes meant death or worse, Kyan said softly. The idea that they can freely express opinions without consequences feels like a trap to many. Elsewhere in the city, another significant event was unfolding. The formerly sealed Carvani archives, vast repositories of historical and cultural knowledge, had been opened to the public. Crowds gathered outside, their excitement palpable as they entered the massive library for the first time. Aaron visited later that day, watching with satisfaction as Cornet citizens eagerly explored texts that had been forbidden to them. Yet, amid the excitement, he noticed small clusters of older citizens standing in corners, looking overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information suddenly available to them. One elderly woman sat on a bench, a historical text open on her lap, tears streaming down her face. When Aaron approached to ask if she was all right, she looked up with an expression of utter loss. Too much, she whispered. Too many words. Too many different ideas. How do we know which is right? The question unsettled him more than he cared to admit. 3 weeks into the transition, the first significant cracks began to appear. The Provisional Council meeting that morning was sparsely attended. Only 8 of the 15 representatives present. When Aaron questioned the absences, Parex Theron offered a response that chilled him. "They are attending the traditional vestment ceremony at the Temple of Order," Parex explained, his tone matter-of-fact. "It is our ancient custom." "But this meeting was scheduled weeks ago," Aaron countered. "We're meant to be discussing the framework for your constitution today." Parex nodded solemnly. "Yes, but the ceremony predates even the Carvani. Some felt it more stabilizing to attend." Lyra Vesson, one of the younger representatives present, couldn't contain her frustration. "They're avoiding responsibility. Making decisions is exactly what we fought for. The right to shape our own future. Freedom to choose also means freedom to avoid choice." "Young one," Parex replied with surprising sharpness. "Not everyone finds your new world as comfortable as you do." The tension in the room was palpable. Aaron intervened before it escalated further, but the exchange lodged in his mind. Freedom that people didn't know how to use would only become a burden. That much was becoming clear. The problem crystallized further the following week during the first public debate held in Mavener Square. The topic was seemingly straightforward, discussing the structure of local governance. But as citizens stepped forward to speak, a pattern emerged that Aaron hadn't anticipated. A group calling themselves the True Order Movement began to dominate the discussion. Their spokesperson, an imposing middle-aged man named Theron Vell, articulated a position that sent ripples of discomfort through the Terran observers. "Personal discipline must supersede all rights," Vell declared to considerable applause. "The Carvani were cruel masters, yes, but their legal structure provided clarity. We propose adapting their codes, with the harshest elements removed, as the foundation for our new society." From his position at the side of the square, Aaron exchanged alarmed glances with Serena. This was exactly what they had fought against: the continuation of authoritarian principles under a new name. Yet when Lyra Vesson and other young leaders rose to counter this position with passionate defenses of individual freedom, their reception was notably cooler from the majority of the crowd. "Citizen freedom is too chaotic," countered an elderly woman who took the podium next. "We need a clear path, strong discipline to survive. The young speak of choices, but too many choices lead nowhere." The debate continued for hours, growing increasingly heated. By its conclusion, a clear generational divide had emerged. Older Cornet citizens predominantly supporting the True Order movement, while the younger generation, those who had actively fought against the Carvani, championed the democratic ideals of the Terran Accord. News of this division spread quickly through interstellar channels. Within days, headlines across Terran space questioned the mission. Quarnal rejecting freedom? Liberation faltering on Quarnal? Ancient culture resistant to democratic values? The Terran Accord Central Command responded with increased support, additional educators, expanded security budgets, and pressure on Aaron to accelerate the adoption of interplanetary democratic models. But these external resources did little to address the fundamental cultural divide growing within Quarnal society. Aaron found himself increasingly torn. His lifelong conviction that freedom was the ultimate aspiration of all sentient beings was being challenged daily. At night, he would stand on the balcony of his quarters, looking out over the ancient city, with its blend of architectural grandeur and practical poverty, wondering if he had been naive. The most disturbing moment came during a visit to Gloria Frost, a city in the northern region predominantly populated by elders. There, an elderly man approached him after a civic education session, hat in hand, eyes downcast in the manner of Carvani subjugation. "Sir," the man began hesitantly, "when will you give us back our disciplines? At least then, we knew what to do." Aaron had no answer that didn't sound hollow, even to himself. His relationship with Serena Voss deteriorated as their viewpoints diverged. What had once been a professional partnership of shared ideals fractured along lines of pragmatism versus idealism. "We're guests here, Aaron," Serena argued during a particularly heated strategy session. We can't force them down the Terran path. If their culture values order over individual expression, who are we to say that's wrong? You're suggesting we abandon them to a repainted version of the same oppression? Oren shot back, his voice rising. The True Order movement is just Carvani control with a friendlier face. No, I'm suggesting we listen to what they're actually asking for, not what we think they should want. Serena's frustration matched his own. The young rebels want democracy. Yes, but they're a minority. The majority seems to want structured transition, not a complete cultural overhaul. Their disagreements spilled over into the broader Terran team stationed on Cornall, creating divisions that undermined their effectiveness. Some staff aligned with Serena's cultural relativism, others with Aaron's democratic absolutism. The fracture couldn't have come at a worse time. As the date for the first elections approached, the election campaign unfolded with an intensity that surprised even the most experienced Terran observers. Two major parties emerged from the chaos of initial political organizing. The Liberty Front, led primarily by younger Cornet, who had fought in the resistance, advocated for complete democratic freedom and closer ties with the Terran Accord. Their campaign materials featured open hands, releasing birds into flight, symbolizing liberation from all constraints. The True Order Party, backed by elders and former mid-level Carvani administrators, promoted a modified version of the previous legal codes, with emphasis on collective discipline and cultural continuity. Their emblem was a geometric pattern of interlocking circles, representing structured interdependence. Aaron and Serena, despite their personal differences, served as official election observers, both confident that democracy would prevail. Surely, Aaron thought, when given a direct choice, the people would choose freedom over constraint. The election day dawned clear and cool, with voter turnout exceeding all expectations. Nearly 90% of eligible Cornet citizens made their way to polling stations across the planet. The atmosphere was solemn rather than celebratory, the weight of this first free choice evident in the careful movements of people who had never before had their opinions counted. As the polls closed and vote counting began, Aaron stood in the central observation center, watching the numbers roll in with growing disbelief. The pattern was undeniable, and by midnight, the outcome was clear. The True Order Party had won in a landslide, capturing 88% of the vote. The Liberty Front managed only 12%, mostly concentrated in youth-dominated urban districts. When the results were announced in Mavenor Square the following morning, the response was as divided as the society itself. Thousands of older citizens erupted in applause, their faces showing relief rather than triumph. Meanwhile, clusters of younger Cornet stood in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from disbelief to anger. What happened next would haunt Aaron for years to come. As Theron Vell took the podium to deliver a victory speech promising a return to structured prosperity, a group of young Liberty Front supporters surged forward, shouting accusations of election fraud and betrayal. Security forces, still operating under old Carvani protocols, responded with immediate force, using stun batons and chemical deterrents to disperse the protesters. Violence erupted across the square. Young protesters hurled stones at the newly elected representatives, while elderly citizens fled in terror. The True Order security forces, emboldened by their electoral mandate, escalated their response, beating protesters who refused to disperse. Oren watched in horror, but his hands were tied by Terran Accord non-interference protocols. After a democratic election, they had no authority to intervene in internal security matters unless genocide or systematic human rights abuses were occurring. This chaotic response to election results, however disturbing, did not cross that threshold. "We have to do something," he hissed to Serena as they watched from the safety of their observation post. "We did do something," she replied, her voice hollow. "We gave them democracy. This is the result. The rioting spread to other cities over the following days. The Terran Accord, constrained by its own principles of sovereignty, could only offer humanitarian aid in the form of medical drones and emergency supplies. Many young leaders of the Liberty Front were arrested under hastily implemented civil order statutes that bore uncomfortable resemblance to Carvani-era laws. Public infrastructure projects stalled as social division deepened. The elderly felt vindicated in their choice of security and order, while the youth seethed with betrayal, feeling that their hard-won freedom had been stolen through democratic means. As the unrest continued into its second week, Serena approached Aaron with a recommendation that felt like surrender. "We should begin withdrawal procedures," she said, placing a tablet on his desk with the formal request already drafted. "Our presence is exacerbating tensions. The elected government views us as undermining their authority, and the opposition sees us as having abandoned them." Aaron stared at the document, the culmination of all his failures. "If we leave now, what happens to those who fought for real freedom?" "They'll have to find their own path," Serena answered softly. "Just as you always said people should." The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. With reluctance, he authorized the report to Terran Accord Central Command. "Quarnal does not require freedom as we understand it. They require order. We have erred in our approach." Before departure protocols could begin, however, Mayor Saren Parax, one of the elder statesmen who had supported the True Order Party, requested a meeting with Aaron at the former presidential palace. Out of diplomatic courtesy, he agreed. The meeting room was austere, stripped of Carvani symbols, but not yet redecorated with any new iconography. Parax sat straight-backed in his ceremonial robes, looking every bit the ancient authority figure, despite the democratic context of his position. "You're leaving us?" Parax stated without preamble. "The Terran Accord respects the democratic choice of the Quarnay people." Aurene replied diplomatically. "Your elected government has made it clear our continued presence is unnecessary." Parax studied him for a long moment. "You're disappointed in us." It wasn't a question, but Aaron answered anyway. "I'm disappointed that after suffering under oppression, your people would choose to maintain systems of control rather than embrace freedom." "Ah," Parax nodded slowly. "And there lies the misunderstanding between our worlds. Envoy Malv, what you see as control, we see as framework. What you call oppression, we call structure." "The Carvani executed citizens for minor infractions," Aaron countered, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "They forced labor camps and thought control. How can any of that be considered beneficial structure?" "The Carvani were cruel, yes," Parax agreed. "Their implementation was monstrous. But beneath their cruelty was a system that gave every person a place, a purpose, a path. When you removed that system and offered nothing but choice in its place, you left many of us standing in an empty field with no landmarks." Aaron shook his head. "We gave you the opportunity to build your own landmarks. Without tools or instructions," Parax countered. "Imagine taking a child raised in captivity and releasing them into a wilderness, telling them, 'You're free now.' Would you call that kindness?" The comparison struck uncomfortably close to Aaron's growing doubts. "We provided education, resources. You provided concepts," Parax interrupted gently. "Abstract ideas about voting and rights. But you never addressed the practical daily question that most of our people face. How do we know what to do now?" Under the Carvani, everyone knew their role, their limits, their place. Brutal as it was clear. Your freedom offers no clarity, only endless questions with no definitive answers. Aaron was silent for a long moment. "So you prefer chains, as long as they're familiar?" Parax smiled sadly. "We thank you for removing the cruel chains, but we recognize that some form of structure, call it discipline, call it order, is necessary for us to stand upright. The young may eventually find their way to your vision of freedom, But they must do so along a path that acknowledges our cultural reality, not one imported from Terran ideals. As Aaron prepared to leave Cornell, he recorded one final personal report, a reflection meant for his own archives rather than official submission. I've realized we confused giving freedom with teaching freedom. When the starving are hungry, we must provide safety before liberty. Freedom itself is not the gift. It's the capacity to bear freedom that must be cultivated. And that capacity grows at different rates in different cultures. The younger Cornet wanted democracy, and perhaps in another generation, they'll achieve it. But we tried to transform millennia of structured existence into individual liberty overnight. We offered no transition period, no framework to replace what we dismantled. I still believe in freedom as the highest aspiration, but I now understand it can't be dropped from orbit like a liberation package. It must grow from within, cultivated by those who understand the soil in which it's planted. The True Order Party is not what I hoped for Cornell. Their system maintains too many elements of control, but it is, perhaps, a necessary transition, a halfway point between oppression and liberty that acknowledges the psychological reality of a people who have never known self-determination. My greatest regret is for the young revolutionaries who glimpsed freedom, only to see it voted away. They deserve better than what we're leaving them with. But perhaps their struggle is the very crucible in which true Cornet democracy will eventually be forged. He ended the recording and stood at the viewport of his quarters, watching as the ancient city of Mavenor faded into twilight. The Terran banners had already been removed from public buildings, replaced not with Carvani symbols, but with the geometric emblem of the True Order Party, familiar patterns rearranged into something new, yet recognizably rooted in the old. The Terran Accord officially withdrew from Cornell 2 days later. The starship Vigilant Resolve silently lifted from the spaceport, its departure witnessed by a small crowd of mostly young Cornet, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with expressions of betrayal. On the surface below, the citizens of Cornell returned to a basic order system established by the True Order Party, a post-Carvani political structure that blended local self-management with collective discipline, founded on a constitutional document called the Rights of Duty. Public order was quickly restored. Markets reopened. Schools resumed with modified curriculums that emphasized both historical knowledge and civic responsibility. Outwardly, Cornell appeared to be stabilizing under its new government. Yet in underground meeting places, the basements of ancient buildings and hidden rooms in the sandstone cliffs, the young leaders of the failed Liberty Front continued to gather. They no longer spoke of immediate revolution or Terran-style democracy. Instead, they discussed patience, education, and cultural evolution. We will continue to learn from the outside world. Lyra Vesson told a small gathering in a subterranean chamber beneath what had once been the Legislative Academy. We cannot remain forever in the shadow of old disciplines. True freedom is something we must discover for ourselves, in our own time, in our own way. Her words didn't echo in grand squares or official chambers. They weren't broadcast on public channels or recorded in government archives. But they persisted, passing from one young mind to another, seeds planted in soil that wasn't yet ready for them to flourish, but someday might be. As the Vigilant Resolve broke orbit and prepared for its jump to the next star system, Aaron stood at the observation deck, watching Cornell reseed into a golden blue sphere against the blackness of space. Serena joined him, their professional differences temporarily set aside in this moment of departure. "Do you think we failed them?" she asked quietly. Aaron considered the question carefully. "I think we misunderstood them, and in doing so, failed ourselves. The next liberation mission will be different," Serena offered. "We've learned valuable lessons here." Aaron nodded, though uncertainty lingered. Freedom isn't a universal constant like gravity. It's a practice, a skill that must be developed. We treated it like a birthright, when perhaps it's more like an art that must be mastered over generations. As Quarnall faded from view, Aaron recalled Parax's final words to him. "We do not reject your freedom, envoy. We simply cannot wear it yet. Perhaps our children's children will grow into the garment you've offered us." In the vastness of interstellar space, one small world continued its halting journey toward a future neither fully free nor fully controlled. A planet finding its own path between the chains of the past and the uncertain liberation of the future. Aaron's final recorded words echoed in the emptiness. Freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility that each must bear for themselves. I hope they find their own way. On the surface of Quarnall, as the lights of the departing Terran ship faded into the night sky, an elderly man and his granddaughter stood on a hillside, watching. "Will they come back someday?" the child asked. The old man considered the stars thoughtfully. "Perhaps. Or perhaps we will go to them, when we are ready." "Ready for what, grandfather?" "Ready to step into the boundless field of choices without fear," he answered. "Ready to stand without the familiar weight of chains we've carried for so long." The child looked confused, but the old man only smiled, understanding something that Aaron Malv had finally learned too late, that between absolute freedom and absolute control lay a vast middle ground where most societies must journey at their own pace, finding balance between structure and liberty, between the comfort of the known and the potential of the unfettered. The True Order Party would rule Quarnall for many years to come. Their governance would be neither as harsh as the Carvani, nor as liberating as Terran democracy. Instead, it would be distinctly, uniquely Quarnay, an intermediate stage in a cultural evolution that had been interrupted but not permanently altered by outside intervention. In basement gatherings and private conversations, however, the ideals of liberty would continue to simmer. Young Quarnay would travel off-world for education, returning with new ideas that would gradually infiltrate the rigid structures of their society. Books from the opened archives would be studied, debated, internalized by generations who had never known Carvani cruelty. Change would come to Quarnall, but it would come on Quarnay terms, at Quarnay speed, through Quarnay understanding. The path would be neither straight nor predictable, neither fully aligned with Terran ideals nor completely reverent of the disciplined past. It would be, simply, their own. Decades later, when Aaron Malv had retired from active service and settled into a teaching position at the Terran Diplomatic Academy, he would receive an unexpected communication from Quarnall. The message, transmitted through standard interstellar channels, contained only a brief text from an unknown sender. "The seeds you planted have not died. They merely needed time to adapt to our soil. The first true blooms are appearing now. Your freedom takes different shapes in our garden, but it grows nonetheless. The chains are loosening with each generation." There was no signature, but Aaron suspected it might be from Lyra Vesson or one of the other young leaders he had left behind. He never responded, knowing that any interference from him, even encouragement, would only complicate their indigenous evolution toward liberty. Instead, he incorporated the lessons of Quarnall into his teaching, ensuring that future planetary envoys understood what he had not. That freedom imposed from without is rarely as effective or enduring as freedom nurtured from within. That different cultures require different paths to liberation, and that sometimes the most helpful thing outsiders can do is provide tools and then step aside, allowing people to build their own versions of freedom rather than imposing prefabricated structures upon them. The Terran Accord would eventually revise its liberation protocols based partly on the Quarnall experience. Future interventions would include longer transition periods, deeper cultural integration, and more flexible models of governance that could adapt to indigenous social structures, rather than replacing them wholesale. It was a bittersweet legacy for Aaron Malv. His failure had become a foundation for more nuanced approaches to interstellar democracy building. The idealism of his youth had been tempered by experience into a more patient, more humble philosophy of liberation. And somewhere on a distant, golden world, people who had once thanked him for the chains were gradually learning to live without them, not because he had shown them how, but because they had discovered their own reasons to stand upright in freedom's uncertain light. In the end, perhaps that was the truest victory of all.